Hi, friends. Welcome aboard. Welcome. My apologies. We are working with getting Mr. Loew on the call. So thank you for joining. And again, we always value your time, and I apologize for the tardiness and appreciate your understanding. And here's Gary. Perfect time. There he is. Awesome. There he is. Perfect, everyone. Excellent. Hi, Gary. Hi, friends who've joined us for Stamp Chat. Hello and welcome. Welcome. So I think we're going to go ahead and just get started.
Okay.
All right. So now we have an intro since we've last had our Stamp Chats with you, Gary. We've really formalized things. So get ready, friends. So welcome to Stamp Chat, everybody. My name's Heidi Rhodes. I work proudly with the APS, and I welcome you to our edition of a 6 o'clock edition. We're going to see how that works out for us. Please welcome Mr. Gary Loew. He's joining us today from Atlanta, Georgia. You probably know him as the editor-in-chief of the American Philatelist, and previously he was the director of expertising at the APS. Stamp Chat is proudly sponsored today by the American Philatelist, which happens to be hot off the press, so be looking in your mailboxes or in your email. We hope you enjoy your monthly copies of the American Philatelist. The AP serves you in two ways. Our articles and columns help you become better informed about stamp collecting, and we connect you to the stamp dealers that have the material that you need. So read, learn, and build your collection. Now, without any further ado, we will introduce Mr. Gary Loew in his presentation, UPU Specimen Stamps and the Irregular Block Mystery. Gary.
Thank you, Heidi. Let's see if I can share my screen and get to this presentation, and here we go. All right, we're going to be talking about UPU specimen stamps, UPU being the Universal Postal Union, which was started in 1875 to rationalize the entire process of moving mails internationally. One of the things that the UPU did was make the determination that every member country needed to know about the stamps of other countries to ensure that they were genuine. And that's the origin of the UPU specimen stamps. And,
excuse me, Gary, your screen isn't being shared.
It isn't.
No, thank you to our audience member. I was busy writing in the chat box.
Okay, well, let me see if I can share my screen. And is it now shared?
Well, one of our attendees is saying that it is, but I'm not seeing it. No, says another person. And while you figure that out, I'll just remind friends who are on the call that this is a webinar, and as such, we've respectively turned off your audio and your cameras. We may end up playing around with that a little bit at the end, but we'll see how that goes. We will be, trying different formats as we continue on with Stamp Chats.
Okay. Are you seeing the splash screen now?
Not yet.
Wow. Let's try that.
There we go. That's it. There we go. Okay, friends,
right.
Again, thank you for your patience. Thank you. Beautiful.
See that? Even a blind pig can root up the occasional acorn, so I guess we stumbled on the solution there. In any event, So I was talking about the definition of the UPU specimen stamps, why they were issued to inform the member countries of what the stamps from other countries looked like. And we'll spend most of our time talking about that. But in the end, we're going to want to take a look at this weird block of 5, irregular shaped block with one missing over there, and try to understand why that happened. Most of what I'll be showing you are stamps of Gambia, primarily because it's this mystery of a Gambia stamp, and I want to be as consistent as possible. The other reason is I collect Gambia, so it's just convenient for me. But the basic principles are the same, and what we're going to be doing today, as soon as I get this to, there we go. On today's agenda, we're going to be explaining what a specimen stamp is. I'll show you an example, a delicious example of the first specimen stamp. Talk a bit about the printing of specimens, ordering and distribution by the Universal Postal Union, some simple multiples, pairs and the like, some strips that are not very common at all, and then we'll chat about that pretty weird irregular block. Now, this is a webinar where it's not a community fest, so we're not going to be able to shout out at each other, but it is time for a pop quiz. So instead of shouting out your answers, feel free to mumble quietly to yourselves. I'm not going to be collecting blue books. You're not going to have to hand in the results of this pop quiz, but just to explore a bit further, my first question is, why are we all here today? And I think the answer to that is because we are all philatelists, of course. That begs a second question. Why are we philatelists? Now this, you can get into the transactional aspects of it, but I wanted to go into the philosophical end of why we are philatelists. So I consulted with a great philatelic philosopher by the name of Scott Adams, and I'll show you what Scott had to say. This is Dilbert, of course, and Dogbert is asking why people collect stamps. Dilbert says, because they're valuable. And then Dogbert wants to know why they're valuable, and the answer is because collectors collect up all of them. And so Dogbert, in his usual incisive fashion, makes the observation, so you collect stamps because they're valuable, and they're valuable because you collect them. Dilbert says, right. And Dogbert observes, that sounds pretty fulfilling, but Dilbert's confession is, to be honest, I just do it for the adrenaline rush. And folks, I have to tell you, that's the best explanation I have for why I do it. I collect stamps for the adrenaline rush. But to get more serious about it, not that I wasn't serious a moment ago, what is a specimen stamp? Marcus Samuel, back in 1976, wrote what was really the first book that codified specimen stamps, and he was focused on the British Crown colonies for the period up to 1948. And his definition was a stamp or a stamp proof that has been provided or preserved as a sample for which no payment has been made to the revenue. The post office didn't collect any revenue, and that has been defaced to prevent its postal or its fiscal use. James Bendon followed up on Marcus's book with the UPU Specimen Stamps from 1878 to 1961. The original edition of that came out in 1988 and was absolutely definitive. His 2015 book is just a mind blower. It's a gorgeous piece of work, profusely illustrated, and in one of the early chapters, he defines 12 kinds of specimen stamps. Postal authority specimens used to identify for, used to notify for local postmasters the issuance of a stamp. Printers' reference specimens were kept by the printers for their own internal reference. They were fully printed, normal, real stamps intended to be issued, but put aside for purposes of the printer's own internal reference. Official reference stamps were kept as part of the post office's reference collection. In the case of the United Kingdom, the British Empire, the Crown agents also kept a full set of these stamps. Presentation specimens, they're still around today, and they're given to visiting dignitaries, a lot of postal conferences, but also if you have a G7 meeting or one of those where the heads of state get together, it is frequently the case that they will issue presentation specimens in very fancy booklets. Stamp printing specimens, really what the printers did is they took older issues that they still had in stock that hadn't been shipped to the requesting postal authority and used those as samples for any of a wide variety of reasons. Printer sample proofs were delivered by the printers to prospective clients. Now they had to be defaced because otherwise they could have been used for postage, but these are marketing tools. Post office training specimens, just what the name suggests, when you're training postal clerks, you got to give them stamps to play with, to practice with, and it is better to use defaced specimen stamps than to give them real live stamps. Remember, all of these stamps had to be accounted for. Every single sheet that was printed needed to be accounted for back to the postal authorities, so the paper was controlled, the number of stamps were controlled. If you couldn't document as a printer that you had taken sheets, full sheets of legitimately printed stamps and either shipped them to the postal authority or defaced them with the specimen marking, you had to pay for them. And you could lose, as in one case actually happened, you could lose a printing contract if you weren't accounting for all the sheets that were used in printing stamps. So for PO training purposes, you needed specimen stamps as well. Exhibition specimens, there were national and international printing exhibitions, and all the printers would show up and show their best work. And if you were in the postal printing marketplace, you wanted to bring examples of your best work, but they had to be defaced with that specimen mark. Philatelic specimens are kind of unique in that excess stamps were sold by postal authorities, not by the printers. These were stamps that were already in the possession of the post office, and rather than destroy them, this is particularly prevalent in South America in the late 1800s, for example, and into the early 1900s, where they would take excess stamps, deface them with the specimen mark, and sell them below face value to collectors. Now, this is different from what happened pretty much also in the same period of time when the post office would either sell the printing plates or the printing plates would somehow disappear, and enterprising, basically forgers, would come along and reprint stamps after they had already been in circulation. That's a different beast. These are legitimate philatelic specimens. Display specimens, you walk into a post office, nowadays you'll see a poster with an illustration of the stamp, but historically it was frequently the case that the post office central authorities would distribute to the individual post office branches specimen stamps to display either on the counters or in display cases to promote the sale of stamps. Press specimens, to keep the media happy, to keep the press happy, they would sometimes distribute a new issue to the press, but those stamps were defaced for obvious reasons. And finally, there were the UPU specimens themselves. Historically, they used to be distributed with the word specimen as a defacement on them. In later years, meaning the early to mid 20th century, it was the case that they were shipped out to the UPU without that defacement. How would you judge that to be a specimen? How would you differentiate that from a normal uncanceled, a mint stamp? The answer is it's only by context, meaning that a page from a specimen book was torn out and sold to the public. So it has to be on a page that's identified as having been from a reference book in some postal authorities' archives, and that's the only way that you can tell those stamps apart from mint, unused, normally issued stamps. So here we can see what is really the first postal authority specimen, and this being the penny black, the first stamp issued in 1840. It antedates the creation of the UPU in 1875. But what you can see here is a notice to all postmasters, and it's got a sample of 2 of the original penny black. This document is dated April of 1840, and of course, May 1st of 1840 is when the penny black was issued. This is a cool piece. There's only 3 known. In case it isn't obvious to you, I'll tell you flat out, it's not in my collection, unfortunately. And if I had a very heavy duty 6 figures, several $100,000, I might be able to purchase one if it ever came back on the market. But no, it's not in my collection. Nor is this. Here's an example of, it's a reconstruction actually, it's not the real full sheet, but it was a full sheet of 240 subjects of that first penny black. So 12 stamps per row, 20 rows, 240. The sales price on that, very conveniently, was a British pound sterling. I made the notation in there. It's not in my author's collection. You can bet on that. Here's one that is, however. This is an example of a printer's sample proof, and it's on unwatermarked paper. It's engraved, but it's imperforate. The stamps were never issued imperforate. In the Samuel book, this is given a designation of DS1. He created an entire taxonomy. You can see that this is imperforate, and you can see the specimen marking. This may be better. You can see the specimen marking over there. When I first acquired this, it was my assumption that this was a forgery, again, because they were not issued in imperforate form. But as it turns out, these are printers' sample proofs on unwatermarked paper, and they are, in fact, legitimate printers' sample specimens. Okay, let's look at a few standard examples. Gambia in the 1880s first began issuing these key plates. I'm sorry, in 1890s, late 1890s, first began issuing these key plates. They were printed in 2 processes. The outer frame and vignette was a single pass, and that's a standard, call it a duty plate, and its purpose was to print the standard format. And then up on top, the country name or colony name was printed, and down below, the denomination. And so it was a two-pass process. All of the key plates are identical across denominations and across various colonies. I think there were 5 or 6 colonies for this particular key plate issue. But here we see an example of S.G. Stanley Gibbons 39A, A being a variation and S meaning specimen. So what we see here is that the A designation came from this distorted S. And it is uncommon in its natural issue form, but as a specimen, there are only 7 possible examples of this stamp. 7 sheets were printed with specimen on them, and so there can be at most 7 of these. Not all have survived. We don't know how many have survived, so a pretty uncommon example of a specimen stamp. Here's an example of a specimen that's just a flat-out forgery. The stamp is legitimate, but the specimen overprint is illegitimate. There are 2 signs of that. If you look on the back, you can see a bleed through. I can tell you for a certainty that no printer would have allowed something like that to happen to one of its stamps. They were controlled and printed very carefully, even the overprint of the word specimen. So that's piece of evidence 1. But also you can see here there's a dot after the word specimen, and that just didn't take place on any of the overprinted specimen stamps. So this is a legitimate Stanley Gibbons number 10 with a forged overprint. Now here we can see some examples from a later issue. This is a King George key plate from 1921, but these are specimens that are in pairs. And you can see on the top 3 rows that they are right marginal pairs. You can see the margins off to the right there. And that makes them pretty uncommon as well. There would be left marginal and right marginal possibilities. And keeping them in pairs and having them show up this way is pretty unusual. These are also some pretty interesting varieties. For example, you can see here that that's a club foot printing error. It's just a plate variety, but it is a documented plate variety. And there's another example here of the broken M, where the bottom of the left-hand portion of the M is not a club foot, but it's broken off. And there's also a break up there at the top. So again, these are standard printing varieties. They're embedded in the plate. They occur regularly, but on specimen stamps, they are not all that common. In fact, I'm guessing that this is probably the only set in existence where you've got both the printing variety and a pair existing in specimen format. There's probably not another set that looks like this. All right, so these are pairs. Let's talk a bit about what kinds of multiples are even possible. Over a period of time, the number of members of the UPU varied. Post offices, postal authorities would join the UPU. Occasionally they would drop out, not all that common, but one source of variation in the numbers of stamps printed as specimens was just the number of members of the UPU. The other reason that you would get a variation in total print quantities was the quantity that was sent to each member. So you can see here in this column, for the first several years, they were sending 5, and then down below, they were sending 3. So they lessened the number of quantities that were required. There's a whole set of explanations as to why that varied over time, but mostly it had to do with the fact that UPU recognized that for most countries that were members, most postal systems that were members of the UPU, they didn't really need that many stamps. The only place you needed a specimen stamp was in a post office that was a foreign office, meaning not one that was overseas, but that received foreign mail. So if you're looking at some small country that might have only one post office where international mail was arriving and processing, that'd be the only place, the first place it lands in that nation, where a postal authority would have to look at an envelope and verify that the stamp was a genuine stamp. So over a period of years, again, beginning in 1909 with the last of the Edward VII issues, the UPU decided that 5 was no longer necessary. Let's only send them 3. So if you want to figure out how many stamps were produced, you would multiply the number of members by the quantity sent to the members, and that's what this quantity required by the UPU amounted to. And then if you look down the column, you'll see there were some years where there were asterisks, and that related to the fact that in addition to the quantities required cumulatively for members, there was also a requirement by the UPU that it kept one additional stamp for its own archive. So that could confound the calculation, especially down here where in the last issue, there was some of those issues where 400 were required, and that included one for the UPU, or 398 were required. In any event, if you take the number of stamps required and divide it by the number of stamps on a pane, which was 60, you could figure out how many panes were likely printed by the printer. Then if you multiply that by the number of stamps and subtract this, which is the number required, you get residual copies. Residual copies were those that were kept by the printers and not sent to the UPU. Again, the printers had to account for every sheet of paper, every stamp on a partial sheet of paper. They had to account for it. So here we see a full sheet of 2 panes. This is how it was printed. Now, this is not a specimen stamp. These are, in this case, for the Cayman Islands, war tax stamps. And but the point here is that you can see a sheet of 120 divided up into 2 panes, and that's the way they were generally shipped to the individual post offices. So now we're back to a full pane of 60, 6 stamps per row, 10 rows. And here's the important point. When the sheets, when the full, rather panes, not sheets, when the full panes were shipped to the UPU divided them up as required. They were torn by hand, they were not cut. So you would see a normal separation, just like you would buying a post office fresh stamp over the postal counter. You can see the fraying that a normal tearing of perforations would result in. These look absolutely the same. Okay, so thinking about what kind of multiples are possible, you would expect the maximum to be 5 or 3, and that makes sense depending on how many were required. And in fact, that proves pretty much to be the case, either 5 or 3. Okay, when 3 stamps were required, the tearing would take place into horizontal strips, and each sheet would produce 20 horizontal strips of 3, 2 strips per row, as you can see, times 10 row is 20 possible strips of 3. When 5 stamps were required, then we went into vertical mode, and you would see 2 sets of 5 strips. Each sheet then would produce, I'm sorry, I don't know why that happened. Okay, here we go. So here's an example of strips of 5 of the 8 stamps in the 1898 Queen Victoria key plates. And sadly, this is not in my collection, but just a beautiful set. As far as is known, this is the only surviving, not just set of 8, but there is no known strip of 5 as a single individual stamp known to have survived. So this is the only example we have seen of those stamps. Now, as I explained, when you saw the cutting or the tearing take place for these 1907s, when 5 were required, all of a sudden we've got not a strip, but an irregular block of 5. The authorities at the UPU, the clerks at the UPU, were all about making life simple for themselves. Why would they go and start tearing sheets into odd combinations like this? The answer is pretty easy to figure out if you stop and think about it, but this is the only known occurrence of an irregular block of 5. These 3 are the only known examples in the British Empire. There is reported, I think it's from Mozambique, that there might be another example of a block of 5. It has been reported, it has not been seen, there are no pictures of it. If you go to James Benden's 2015 book, these are the only 3 examples that he reproduces. And I was very pleased that James included these in the book. I think James was pretty pleased too, because there's nothing else like it around. But what's the explanation for this? Well, the answer is that while the UPU did the tearing of the shipment, it is also the case that the number of stamps shipped by the printer was an exact match for the total required, or 726 stamps. Well, there were 13 sheets that were required. 12 sheets would have been exactly 720, but there were 6 more needed. So there were 54 stamps left over. What was shipped was 12 complete sheets, and a block of 6. Now, the postal clerk could just as easily have taken a strip of 5 vertically. If he wanted to really perplex future stamp collectors, he could have torn a strip of 5 horizontally, but he did what was easiest for him and probably safest, since he was doing the tearing, and he tore off a 2x3 block. And the UPU, as you can see from that asterisk, required one stamp for itself and then distributed the block of 5 because it was given a block of 6 and not a strip of 5, or in this case 6. So that's how these blocks came to be in existence. All right. So that, I think, solves the mystery of how this came to be. Again, it's the only known example, and this mystery has been solved. But there's one other mystery that maybe some of you have spotted, and that is these little holes on 3 stamps among these 15. So what's the explanation for the 3 holes in 2 of these blocks? They appear nowhere else. They have not been seen on any other specimen stamps from this series. Now, there are a lot of specimen stamps out there where defacement took place. They are not UPU specimens. They are printer-related specimens where the printer defaced the stamps before putting them out in circulation. But those are much larger diameter holes and were not done on any Gambia stamps or any British colony stamps in this time frame. And again, it's only on 2 of these 3 blocks and seen nowhere else. The answer, well, a possible answer is that these are wormholes. It is not uncommon to see insect larvae chewing on stamps, especially in the warm climes of West Africa. But a close inspection of those 3 circular holes shows that beyond a doubt, they are absolutely and perfectly symmetrical. And it's hard to tell from this particular scan here, they are of identical size. It had to have been done by the same punching device. Those are very clean holes. They had to be done by some sort of metallic device. So this continues to be a mystery. Can't blame a worm for it, and we don't know why it was done. Back a year ago, June 19, I wrote up this particular set of challenges, and it appeared in the Journal of the West African Study Circle called Cameo. If you'd like a copy of that paper, I would be quite pleased to send it to you, or you can download it. Indeed, all of my articles and papers can be downloaded for free from the website academia.edu. And here's the URL for my articles. I think I've uploaded probably close to 40 of the articles I've written, all available, all for free. You don't have to join academia.edu to get a hold of them. So if you're curious about this article or anything I've ever written, that's the email, that's the URL for the academia website. Okay, let me go back to my philosopher friend, Scott Adams, philatelic philosopher friend, Scott Adams. And here's my final observation, his final observation, where Dogbird is saying, help me look for valuable stamps. You're better at this than I am. And Dilbert warns him, philately will get you nowhere. Well, Dogbert didn't like that answer, but I can tell you, philately will take you everywhere around the world in so many interesting ways. So I thank you very much, and happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hi, Gary. Thank you. Lovely, lovely. And I have to concur, Philately will take you everywhere, everywhere. Here we go with our questions. Is that a security punch hole in the LR corner of the bottom stamp of the irregular block of 5?
Well, the security punches were of a different size, and there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to these holes, and there were 3 of them in the 3-shilling orange stamp. You can see them in the 2 upper stamps. There's no reason to suspect that they could be security punches, because none of the printers, and certainly the UPU authorities themselves, were making holes of this kind, this size. The diameter is different from every other security hole we've ever seen. The punches were different. And we've never seen examples of any kind of security punch on stamps of the British Empire from this period of time, of the British colonies, I should say, from this period of time. So there's just no match between this occurrence and any other evidence to suggest that they are security holes. That's always a possibility, but we've never seen an explanation. I've never been able to identify an explanation. I spoke with James Bendon about it. He's as perplexed as the rest of us that pay attention to this. In the article that I wrote for Cameo, I, of course, asked this question, and none of the experts in the West African Study Circle have identified a realistic, documentable explanation. So could it be, in theory, a security punch? Yes, it's possible, but we've never seen anything like it elsewhere, so it's hard to make that leap of faith. It's just one of Philately's many mysteries.
The joy. Could those blocks of 5 have come from the residuals?
From the residuals? No. These were released from the postal archives. The origin is known. They were released from the postal archives of a French West African colony. So we know where they came from, and that's been determined. So the provenance of these things is known. But that's an excellent question.
Yeah, and we have a lot of questions. Thanks so much for joining us, Gary. Some early UPU specimens appear to have rubber stamped overprinted specimen imprints in either violet or black. Were these applied by the UPU on receipt or applied by the issuing postal authority prior to being sent to the UPU, or both?
Well, the issuing postal authority wasn't the one that was doing specimen overprinting. That was done by the stamped printers from their stock, and indeed for the most part, from their early stock, because the first thing you wanted to release was the specimens, so that when the stamps went into use, they would have been pre-identified. So it was the printers that were sending the specimen stamps, not the postal authorities. They never touched the UPU specimens. As to the different colors, I think that had to do, I'm not sure of this, but I think that had to do for the most part with what the individual printers were doing. They weren't always the top 3 printers. I don't know if your question refers to British Empire stamps or elsewhere around the world, but there were a whole, over the many years from 1875 forward, there were many different printers besides the 2 security printers that were the primary producers of stamps in the British Empire. So some of the printers would use non-black.
Okay, would that then, because we have another question, so what is the brown discoloration around those punch holes on the red stamps? Is that from the printer? Or
The brown discoloration, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I've noticed it there, but it might have to do with the punch having, severed fibers and allowed moisture to get in, although if that was the case, you would expect foxing to show up elsewhere. It is some kind of foxing. And again, this came from a West African nation, the archive of a West African nation. So the humidity down there was never kind to postage stamps. And that may account for the foxing close to the holes, but I don't know the answer definitively.
okay, and referring back to the early UPU specimens, the question that we had beforehand, our participant clarified that it was Switzerland in particular that he was asking about.
Yeah, again, that would be the printer's determination. I'm not familiar with the specimen stamps of Switzerland, but it could easily have been a specification that the postal authority imposed on the printer. So I do know that there's a section in James Benden's new edition, the 2015 edition, that talks about the process of imprinting and goes into inks and colors. I just don't recall what the answer is, but you'll find the answer in that book.
Okay. How did specimen appear on the market?
Okay. It is, the purpose of a specimen stamp is to let a local postal authority, a foreign postal authority, know what a legitimate stamp looks like. After stamps were replaced by subsequent issues, there came a period of time when you just didn't see those anymore. And there was no particular reason other than, instinctive archival retention to hang on to those stamps. So many postal authorities found that it would be a good source of revenue to sell off the more ancient, the no longer in use examples. It's also the case that there was some dishonesty. You wouldn't see it in large strips, but you would see it in single examples. Consider when 3 stamps were distributed to an archive in a country that only had 1 post office that was receiving international mail. A clerk might find an opportunity to raise a few shekels or a few pounds or a few shillings by taking one of those 3 and selling it on the market. The same way that in normal stamp production, we have what's called printer's waste, which is a postal or a printer employee that basically steals a damaged stamp and sends it out on the marketplace. So some of them snuck out illicitly, but for the most part, these were sold by the postal authority out of their archive when they were no longer necessary for validation purposes. Some countries, when they merged, found that they had 2 sets of stamps and would sell off a complete archive. If you look on James Benden's website today, you will see full pages of specimen stamps where the stamps are just glued onto the pages, literally glued on to the pages, and they are for sale because Mauritania, for example, several years ago sold off its entire archive other than current issues. And it is very much the case that much of the supply on the marketplace today comes from legitimate sales out of archives.
Going back to the 12 types of specimens, are canceled to order stamps therefore classified as philatelic specimens? They are defaced and sold at less than face value.
If it doesn't say specimen, or it doesn't appear glued down onto something that is clearly a page from an archival book, it's not a specimen. Those are CTOs, canceled to order. And they were defaced by the postal authority as opposed to a creation that was built by the printer itself. So anytime you see the word specimen, no, that's too strong a term, because there are some stamps that were overprinted specimen, but the vast majority of cases, if it says specimen, that overprint was applied by the printer and not by the postal authority. A CTO, cancel to order, is just an alternative way of selling what used to be an unused stamp to the public or to the collecting public at below face value. The difference between the two is a specimen stamp is unused. A CTO is a misuse of a canceling device to take a stamp that has seen no postal service and sell it as a used stamp. And when I was when I was head of expertising, there was this raging debate going on about whether a CTO is a used stamp or an unused stamp. And my reply is, it's a canceled stamp. It has not, a CTO has not seen postal use. So you can't call it used, can't call it unused, it's simply canceled.
What happened when a country joined the UPU during the lifetime of a stamp issue? Did they receive specimen stamps at a later date?
Great question. No.
Okay, that was easy.
Yeah.
All right. For the purpose,
I'll ever get.
What's that?
That's as brief as I'll ever get.
I know, Gary. Come on. Okay, so you mentioned a good source of revenues for administration to sell specimen. Do we know at what prices they were sold, and are there any official records of the prices?
Sometimes, and there's two ways to make or to estimate that determination. Some of the more recent sales of archives were done at auction, where the seller was the postal authority out of their archive. And you can look at the realizations of those sales and find out what they sold for. Or, for example, you can go to James Benden's website, and he's the specialist internationally in specimen stamps. But there are other dealers out there who have them, obviously, from time to time. But if you look on his website, you will see the kind of pages, full pages that I'm talking about. And you can judge from his prices what his, if you can guesstimate what his cost might have been to get a flavor for what the realizations were. Some of these went for, some of these archival collections went for, serious tens of thousands of dollars. I don't know that they got to six figures, but certainly many tens of thousands of dollars for a complete archive. And they get broken up and sold to collectors based on whatever your particular area of collecting interest is.
Were the Gambia stamps sold on Nassau Street? If you read any of Pat Hurst's books on Nassau Street dealers, some of them actually tacked the stamps to a board to display them.
You're talking about the pinholes on stamps. Yes, that's very true. Amazing how we've changed as a hobby from, well, in many, many ways, but yeah, displaying them on boards in pinholes, tacking them, with hinges onto pages and tacking the pages into the windows of stamp stores where they got bleached. All kinds of condition issues that those early dealers in the 20s and 30s and into the 40s would do before condition started to be a relevant factor in valuing stamps.
Are postal authorities still sending UPU specimens to each other for all new issues?
I don't think so. I'm not aware that it's still going on, but I should know the answer to that. I do not.
Where did the stamps available for sale to collectors come from? Where were the extra stamps issued?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Okay, so where did the stamps available for sale to collectors, where did they come from? And were there extra stamps issued?
Oh, well, if you go back to that structure of a sheet analysis that I did, I don't think there was a single example during the period I covered of the required number of stamps exactly matching the number of stamps on a sheet or an even multiple of that. There were always stamps left over. But those were retained by the printers, again, because they had to account for them. And if they used them for any of the other, well, 10 out of those 11, the remaining 11, where the UPU was the 12th, they had to account for those, and they did, and they were allowed to use them. Part of the agreement between the printer and the postal authority is that they could use stamps as specimens to help them promote their wares.
All right, we have one final question. Friends, if we don't get to your question, I regret you. You're more than welcome to email me at heidi@stamps.org, and I can forward the email over to Gary. We'll have this one last question. For the purpose of the presentation, are we stopping at 1920 or 1961? If not, do you know if the UPU still distributed all the issued stamps to all members? Does that make sense to you?
In the 60s, they were still issuing UPU specimens.
Okay.
I just don't know where the stopping point was.
All right. Well, then we're gonna use it and abuse it. We got 60 seconds here. Oh, it says Portugal used 5 additional overprints besides specimen 4 specimens. If that helps at all. And our final question, friends, could the blocks of 5 come from the residual stamps not sent to the UPU?
The answer is that they did not, because we know where they came from. They came from the postal archive of a French West African colony. So it was definitely a UPU distributed block of 5.
Well, as I mentioned, friends, for any of those questions that we weren't able to get to, go ahead and send them to me in an email and I will forward them over to Gary. Email is Heidi@stamps.org. And I'll be sure to get those over to Gary. Gary, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And thank you to all of our live participants and our future participants who will be watching on YouTube. If you haven't subscribed to APS YouTube, well, I suggest that you go over where we have over 65 hours of stamp chats. And Stamp Chat today was brought to us by the APS editorial department. In the American Philatelist monthly feature, My Stamp Story, we're letting APS members like you take the reins and tell readers why you love to collect and what brought you to here, what brought you to the hobby. We've heard from educators who use stamps in their classrooms to teach history, people who began collecting while on active military duty, artists, lawyers, doctors, environmental active advocates. The list goes on and on. Now we want to hear from you. So email your story to aparticle@stamps.org. That's aparticle@stamps.org. Include a photo of yourself and your collection. We look forward to hearing your stamp story. Again, for more stamp chats, go ahead and go over to the APS YouTube channel. Hit like and subscribe. If you have not subscribed to our newsletter at stamps.org, go ahead and do that. We let you know upcoming stamp chats before anybody. So go ahead over to stamps.org, check out the newsletter, and while you're there, check out membership. If you're not an APS member, now's the time. We've got a great deal going on. Use the coupon code VSS 2020. You'll receive 16 months of APS membership for the cost of 12. So thanks so much, everybody. Thanks, Gary. Stay safe, everyone. We'll talk.
Thank you,
See you
folks.
soon.
Appreciate you showing up.
Bye. Bye, Gary.
Bye.